In this video we're going to introduce django-ninja-extra, which is a package that augments Django Ninja with extra functionality. Now, an example of what is added by django-ninja-extra includes class-based patterns, for example grouping your API endpoints into an API controller class, and you can also get permissions that you can apply to all of the routes in a class or at an individual route level. And these permissions are quite similar to what you see in Django REST framework, so it's bringing that functionality to Django Ninja. We also get other features such as authentication, dependency injection, and also throttling. So we're going to explore some of these in this video. If you're interested in additional content, let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Let's dive in and we're going to explore django-ninja-extra in this video. So let's start with a quick look at the django-ninja-extra GitHub page. We can see that this has 231 stars and is under active development. The last push to the master branch was 2 weeks ago. And if we look at the About section here, we can see that django-ninja-extra provides class-based utilities and more for Django Ninja. And we're going to look at some of these utilities, including classes for controllers and permissions, as well as throttling. Now we're going to extend the application that we built previously with Django Ninja, and it was this one here where we had a set of devices in the database and we were serving those to a next.js application. If we look at api.py, you can see we instantiate a Ninja API and we have some route handlers here that use the app.get decorator, as well as for endpoints that are creating new resources, the app.post decorator. Now these are function-based views, essentially. They're function-based route handlers. When we move to django-ninja-extra, we're going to move these and migrate them to class-based views. And these classes that consolidate API endpoints can be thought of as controller classes in Django Ninja. So what we're going to do is look at the documentation for django-ninja-extra, and you can see some of the key features here. I'll leave a link to this below the video. Some of the extra features that are offered here are this class-based paradigm, as well as things like permission classes and dependency injection. Now let's start by having a quick look at the installation here, and we're going to install this into our project. So let's copy the pip install command for django-ninja-extra, and I'm going to go back to VS Code where I have this Django application and the Python virtual environment. We're going to paste the pip install command in here, and that's going to install django-ninja-extra into this environment. Now once we have that installed, we can go to Django's settings.py file and we need to add ninja-extra to the installed apps list. So at the bottom of this, let's add ninja-extra here, and that is exactly what they say in the documentation. You can copy that and add it to your installed apps. Now we're going to have a quick look at the usage code here, and we're going to note some of the differences between Ninja-extra and the normal Django Ninja setup. Now first of all, we import Ninja-extra API and we instantiate that. And that is slightly different from what we're doing at the moment, where we are instantiating the Ninja API object. And the first thing we're going to do is change this up, so we're going to do that in a second. Let's go back to the documentation. You can see that you have function-based definitions, but what we're going to do is create an API controller class. So you can create a Python class here and use a class decorator, and that's the API controller decorator from Ninja-extra. And then within the class you can create methods that represent routes in your application. So for an API that has certain domain boundaries, you can group the domains into classes, and that consolidates the logic in those classes, and you can also share some properties between the endpoints. Now let's start with this. What I'm going to do is bring this import into our project. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to replace the Ninja API import with the Ninja-extra API. And the Ninja-extra API is what we're now going to instantiate to create this app object. Now this application should still work out of the box even though we've changed this object, because Ninja-extra API is essentially a subclass of Ninja API. It's going to provide the same route functionality here, and we can actually see that if we go to the definition of Ninja-extra API. You can see that it's a subclass of Ninja API. So all of the normal functionality is still going to work. So let's start the Django server with the run server command, and if we go to the /API/devices endpoint, you can see that we get back all of the devices. So all of the functionality is still working. We still have a valid API. We've just changed the object that's being instantiated here to the Ninja-extra API. Now one of the main functionalities that is offered here is the ability to group these endpoints into an API controller class, and that's what we're going to do now. Now in order to create a controller, we need to use a class decorator in Python, and the one we're going to import here is the API controller decorator from Ninja-extra. And when we've got that, what we can do is we can create a class here, and I'm going to call this class device controller. Now, as I said, we need to decorate that with this API controller decorator, and we can provide a route prefix here for all of the endpoints that are going to be grouped in that controller class. And I'm going to use the /devices prefix here, and that matches what we have in all of the endpoints for these devices. So for example, the endpoint fetching all of them, that is API/devices here, and the one that will fetch an individual object is /devices/slug. And we're going to migrate these into this controller class, so we're going to give the endpoints that particular prefix. Now, one thing we can also do if we go back to the documentation for django-ninja-extra is we can apply tags to our endpoints. So what I'm going to do is copy this and I'm going to paste it into the decorator. And let's give this controller the tag of devices. And finally, we can also assign some permissions here. So for now, I'm going to make that an empty list, and we will change that later on. So let's paste that permissions empty list into the controller, and now we can start actually migrating the API routes into that controller. Now, in order to create the routes, I'm going to go to the top here, and I'm going to import the route function or the route decorator from django-ninja-extra. And then within the controller, we can create methods that are decorated with this route decorator. And this decorator works similarly to what you see down here. So I'm going to copy this segment of code and we can paste that in here. So we can use the route.get decorator, and we can remove the URL path from this because we now are adding that to the controller itself. So all endpoints within the controller are going to get /devices added to the URL. We can just use a slash in there. And finally, we can migrate the function itself. The function is called getDevices. So I'm going to paste that in here and fix the indentation. Now, the one change that we need to make to this getDevices function is that because we have an instance method now on the class, instead of the request, we're going to accept self as an argument. So we can save that, and what we can do is remove this function-based API route handler, and we're going to save everything and go back to the browser, and hopefully this is still going to work. There is one extra step I need to do before we test this out though. We need to go back to the documentation, and at the bottom of this code we are taking our API object and calling a function called register controllers, and we pass the controller class into that function in order to register all of the routes that are defined in that class. So let's do that now. I'm going to copy this line of code, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and just right at the bottom of this file I'm going to paste this code, and we need to change the class here and also the name of the app object. We called that app, and the name of the class was device controller. So we're going to copy that and put that in there, and that's going to register all of the routes in the controller class. At the moment we only have one of them, but we can now test to see if this device list page is still working. So let's go back to the browser, and we're going to go to this API/devices endpoint. When we refresh this, we're now getting method not allowed. Now, the reason for this is because we are mixing these class-based and function-based endpoints, and we actually have two endpoints going to /devices. One is this get request, but we also have a post request here to /devices as well, and this is a function-based route. And I think the one in the class is being overwritten by this one here. So what we're going to do is actually copy the post request endpoint into the class as well. We were going to do that later in the video, but I'm going to now try and do this now. If we paste that in here and tab this over, we need to change app.post to route.post. So let's do that just now. And we can also remove the route segment because that is now coming from the class controller definition. So in the API controller decorator, we are specifying /devices there, so we can get rid of that route segment. And finally, we can change the request parameter to this method to the self parameter from the class. Now, if we save this, we've now got the endpoint for creating a new device, as well as getting all of the devices from the database. These are now both in the controller class. Let's test this out. If we go back to the browser, this time when we refresh the page, we are now getting back all of the devices. And we can also test the post request here that we're sending to create a new device. Now, in the original Django Ninja video, we had this file called requests.http, which is using the VS Code REST client extension. You can define requests to your API in VS Code using this extension. And here's one here where we sent a post request to that endpoint to create a new device. So what I'm going to do here is change the location ID to 2, and we're going to send that request. And you can see we get back a new device that's been created after sending that post request, and that contains, for example, an ID as well as the name and slug for that particular device. So it would appear that the post endpoint is also working, and we've moved that into our API controller class. Let's also move this endpoint into the class. So let's tab it over and replace the app decorator with the route decorator. And again, we can remove the devices part from the URL path. And finally, we can change the parameter to self. And we can test this out on the browser. So for example, if we go to /API/devices, and let's copy the slug for the CO2 sensor and paste that in there. This time we get back the response for that individual device, and again the functionality to fetch that is now within this controller class in django-ninja-extra. So you can see the benefits here if you enjoy working with classes, and more importantly, as we'll see later on in the video, if you want to apply permissions across all of the routes that are defined in a class. This is very useful functionality, and it brings it slightly more in line with what Django REST framework offers. So you get these things like permissions and throttling, and also options for authentication that you can apply both at the class level as well as at the individual route level. Now there's one last function that I want to move into this class, and it's the update device location function, and I'm just going to do that now. It's the same process as we followed for the other routes. And just like that, we now have a function defined in the class, and it uses the route.post decorator for this class method called update device location. And don't forget to change the request argument to self as well. Now the good thing is that the logic for these functions, for every single function that we've moved into the controller class, that will remain the same. So it's just a matter of restructuring the code a little bit, and it would be helpful of course if you have some unit tests for these endpoints to make sure that after you make these changes, everything is working as expected. And as a side note, if you're interested in any videos on Python testing or testing in any other language, let us know in the comments, and also check out the 𝗏𝗚stack channel where I'm making videos, and very soon we'll be making videos on testing. Let's now move on, and we're going to look at this final endpoint here that we have. This is the only one that's still a function here that's not within a class. And we're going to create a new controller because this represents a different domain essentially. This represents the locations that are available in the database. And we have a single function that should be called getLocations, but I think I called that getDevices in the original video. We're going to move this into a controller class now. And the process is going to be very similar to what we did before, so I'm just going to remove this and paste in the new code. We decorate the class with the API controller decorator, and the route segment is /locations, and we give it a tag of locations as well. And as before, we're not including any permissions on this class controller at the moment. And finally, we have a route.get method that's going to return a list of these locations, and again we've changed the parameter from request to self. Now when we create a new class, we also need to register that class with the register controllers method, so we can paste the name of the class in here, and then we can go to the browser and we can test this out. So it's going to be /API/locations, and we get back all of the locations. So all of these endpoints are now working, and we've moved them into django-ninja-extra controller classes here. Let's now move on. We're going to look at permissions in django-ninja-extra. Now I'm going to start by going back to the documentation for django-ninja-extra, and we have a section under the API controller, and that is the controller permission. So let's click that, and the concept of this permission system, it comes from Django REST framework. So it's very similar if you've used Django REST framework to apply permissions to your API endpoints. This is going to feel very familiar, and even the class names are the same. So if we look at a class name here, there's one called isAuthenticated or read-only, and that exists as well in Django REST framework. Now what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and right at the top of api.py, I'm going to import the permissions module from Ninja-extra, and I'm going to go to the definition of that module, and we can see the permissions that are available by default in this package. And you can see we have permissions such as allow any, isAuthenticated, isAdmin user, and isAuthenticated or read-only. And these are all available in Django REST framework, and these are the base permissions that you can use in Ninja-extra, but of course you can define your own permissions as well, and that is noted in the documentation. If you need to define a custom permission, you can override the base permission class, and you can define the logic in this hasPermission method. Now we're going to keep things very simple in this video, so let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to just work with the getDevices endpoint. So we're going to apply some permissions to that one, but we're going to start by applying the permissions across the entire device controller class. And in order to do that, to this permissions list, we can actually fill this in with a value. And we're going to use permissions, and the class we want to use in that module is the isAuthenticated class. So what's going to happen here is that for every single route within our API controller class, the user must be authenticated now in order to get back a response with the data for each of these routes. And that includes the route to create a new device as well. So let's test this out now that we've added the permission to the class decorator. Let's go back to the browser, and I'm going to go back to /API/devices. And this time you can see we get a message, and the message is telling us that we do not have permission to perform this action. And as I said, that's going to apply to all of the routes within the device controller. So for example, if we go back to our requests.http file and we try and create a new device in this API, we can send the post request, but we're going to get back that same message telling us that we don't have permission. So we need to be logged in now in order to perform these requests. Now we can also use these permissions at the route handler level. So for example, here we have a route handler and it's the route.getDecorator. What we can do if we don't want to apply this permission to every single route in the class is we can remove it from that list, and we can add the permissions argument here to the decorator itself. So we're going to paste that in there. So it's permissions.isAuthenticated. We're applying that now only to the get devices route. If we go back to the browser and refresh the page, we're still getting that same message here. But if we go back to requests.http and send a request, we can actually create a new device now, and that's because the create device function, this route handler, this does not have any permission based restrictions. Anyone can send that post request and create the device. And we can mix and match these permissions across the class however we like. So for example, I could remove this and we can apply a permission back at the class level. And let's add the permission is authenticated or read-only. And as it says here, the request is authenticated as a user or is a read-only request. What that means is that endpoints such as this one that return lists of existing data, these are fine. These are going to allow a response to be generated. But endpoints such as this one that create new data, they are not read-only endpoints, so we will need to be authenticated in order to send a request. Let's test that out very quickly. If we go to the device list endpoint, we get a list of devices as a response. If we go back to requests.http and try and create a new device, this time we're getting that permission error. So that's permissions. It's very easy to apply these using django-ninja-extra, and the functionality is very similar to Django REST framework. Let's now move on to the final part of this video. We're going to look at throttling. Now I'm going to go to the documentation on this, and you can see a definition of what throttling is. This can be seen as a permission that determines if a request should be authorized, and it includes a temporary state that's used to control the rate of requests that clients can make to the API. And in order to do this, we can import the throttle decorator and decorate our endpoints with that throttle decorator. But we're going to do that just now, so let's copy the name of this, and right at the top of the file, I'm going to import that from django-ninja-extra. And let's add the throttle decorator to the get devices function. So we're going to add that here, and we're going to see now what effect that has. So let's go back to the documentation, and we're going to go down to the policy settings section. And again, I'll leave a link to all of these pages below the video. Now basically the settings for throttling are defined in Django's settings.py file, and for django-ninja-extra in general, you can define settings in a dictionary called ninja-extra. Now what I'm going to do is just copy this, and we're going to go to Django's settings.py file, and I'm going to go to the very bottom of this file, and I'm just going to paste that in here. And you can see what is here in this dictionary. We have a key called throttle classes, and we have separate classes for anonymous users and also for logged in or authenticated users. And you can see the rates that are applied here. So for example, an authenticated user by default can send 1000 requests a day to any endpoint that has this throttle decorator. So 1000 requests a day for an authenticated user. If it's an anonymous user, we can send 100 a day by default. Now I'm going to change this for demonstration purposes. So what I'm going to do for anonymous users is I'm going to set that to 2 requests a day. And as I said, that's going to be applied to any endpoints that have this decorator here. And currently we are applying the decorator to the get devices endpoint. So let's save this now and go back to the browser. And from this moment, these throttling settings are going to be applied. So I can send 1 request now and we get back a response. If I send a second request, we also get the response. I'm now going to send a third request as an anonymous user, and this time you can see we get a different message. We're told that the request was throttled, and we can try again in 86,000 seconds. So we have a daily limit on the number of requests based on these settings for the throttle rates. So it's very easy now to add throttling using Django Ninja endpoints. We just have this decorator that we can apply to any number of routes, or even to the class, I believe. And I think this example demonstrates how easy it is to apply different routes within an API controller and use permissions and throttling on those routes. Now there's a lot further we can go with Django Ninja-extra. We could look at things like model controllers, authentication and API keys, as well as API testing using PyTest. We're going to leave it here for now, but if you have any suggestions, please let us know in the comments. And again, please consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel if you've not already done so. And also consider buying the channel a coffee. There's a link below the video for that. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.